The first thing I want to tell you is we don't have a financial problem. We have a secret governance system that is not transparent and is centralized in control. And in fact, what we're watching as it centralizes, a wonderful scholar from the UK who calls it omnivore, he says it's the weaponization of everything. But we're seeing new and potentially wonderful digital technology used instead to centralize control in area after area in all aspects of our life. And the problem is not so much with the tools themselves, it's with the secret governance system and how they decide to use it. So I believe there is only one way to stop the move to total central control, and that is by preventing control of our digital transactions, our financial transactions. That's what I want to talk about today. So everything I'm going to say, one of the candidates and their economic staff, I was going back and forth trying to help them, and finally I said, I need to write a briefing about what's really going on in the federal finances, what the real problems are, and what we can do about them. So everything I'm going to touch on today is much more thoroughly documented at the Solari report. This is called the Solari paper number 1, and it's a briefing on what I call the financial coup d'etat. Clay referred to the 21 trillion missing. The federal government since fiscal 1998 has intentionally and systematically broken the laws related to financial management of both its credit and its appropriations. And that is what, if you look at anything that's driving what some people call the swamp and the corruption, it is operating the federal government outside of the financial management laws. If you go to our website on, we call it missingmoney.solari.com, but our website on Missing Money, we have 7 briefing papers. I finally despaired of the journalist community understanding how the financial laws of the United States government work. So we spent a year and we wrote 7 briefing papers on what are the monetary and fiscal laws of how the federal government should be operated. And in fact, it's a remarkably good infrastructure, a remarkably good legal infrastructure if we would only follow it. Sometimes reformers tell you we need new laws. No, we don't need new laws. We simply need to enforce the excellent laws we have, starting with the Constitution. Anyway, so that is there if you wanted a resource and you want to dive deeper. So I want to tell you a story, and I'm going to use a video to do it. This happened to me in 2000, and it's when I really got to the gist of the problem of why we couldn't turn things around politically. So I'm going to tell you the red button story, but I'm going to start with a video. So go ahead if you could play that. The red button. You never want to have an epiphany in the middle of a speech, but I did. In the summer of 2000, I was speaking to a wonderful group of people called Spiritual Frontiers Foundation International. And they have a conference once a year to talk about how they can help evolve our society spiritually. So they're very dedicated, wonderful people. A friend of mine had asked me to give a speech called How the Money Works on Organized Crime. And in the middle of the speech, I was describing the fact that a reporter who was I was doing research for had been told by the Department of Justice that the U.S. economy and financial system launders $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of all dirty money. So I said to this wonderful group of spiritually evolved people, what would happen if we stopped laundering $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of all dirty money? So we had a little interaction, and they said, well, you know, the stock market would go down because that money would leave and go to Hong Kong or Singapore or Zurich, and we'd have trouble financing the government deficit because we would offend the people who control that money and the accumulated capital for many years thereon. And so our government checks might stop or our taxes might go up. So I said, okay, well, let's pretend there's a big red button up here on the lectern. And if you push that button, you can stop all hard narcotics trafficking in your community, your state, your country tomorrow, thus offending the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion of annual dirty money. And so I said, who here will push the button? And out of 100 people, only 1 would push the button. And I said to the other 99, why would you not push the button? And they said, We don't want our mutual funds and our IRAs to go down in price. We don't want our government checks to stop, and we don't want our taxes to go up. And so that's what I call the red button problem. And what the Solari mission is about how do we turn the red button green? In other words, how do we make money pushing the red button? Because if we can make money pushing the red button, then we can push the red button. We're getting back to the slides. Okay. So the president's going to return to the Oval Office on January 21st. And he's going to, his political Karl Rove kind of guy is going to turn to him and say, go ahead to the next slide. He's going to say, the American people just spent billions of dollars getting you elected. And now they want payback. They want their community block development grant. They want their COLA increase. They want their defense contract. And he's going to turn to his Secretary of Treasury, who's going to say, well, you better be nice to the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion. That was in 1998. It's a much bigger number now, especially with financial fraud. You got to be nice to those people. And so the question is, how is the president and their administration going to hit the red button or turn it green unless the states and the counties are prepared to do it with them? Because in fact, there's an incredible opportunity. If you re-engineer the federal money to optimize the economy instead of to institute central control, there's enormous wealth, new wealth that can be created, including with the blessings of new technology. But what you're going to do in Brooklyn is totally different than what you're going to do in Tulsa, which is totally different. I live in Hickory Valley, Tennessee. It's going to be totally different in Hickory Valley, Tennessee. It has to be decentralized. It has to be bottom up. And of course, you know, what Washington always wants to do is centralize more power. I'll never forget being in a meeting with one of the secretaries, and we were meeting with somebody and trying to persuade them to go along with our legislative agenda. And he said, well, you know, I thought you're Republican. I thought they like to decentralize. And one of the little policy wonks said, yeah, but we're here now. So, you know, again and again, Democrats or Republicans, that's what happens. Okay, so we published a study in 2018 called The State of Our Currency. And it was an overview of the dollar system and what was happening in the dollar system. And one of the things we pointed out was the ability of the dollar system to extract subsidy that could, in fact, pay back or support the body politic was waning. The other thing that was happening is as the 21 trillion had gone missing, we had failed to provide, think of that as a laundry out of our retirement funds. And as people started to retire, because you hadn't provided the money in our retirement accounts that had been promised, in fact, something had to be done. And in fact, what has been done is we are steadily lowering life expectancy and bringing lots of immigrants who put more money in the system. And that is delaying the balance of the books. So essentially what we said is the system is long in the tooth, and either the subsidy has to be cut or changed, and the danger is the central bankers will go to a system of total control, which is what is happening. The next thing we published was something about the going direct reset. Who here has heard of the going direct reset? Okay. The World Economic Forum calls it the Greater Reset, but in fact, in the August of 2019, the central bankers met at Jackson Hole, where they meet once a year, and they reviewed a plan prepared by a group of retired central bankers through the BlackRock Investment Institute that laid out a plan on how you would reset the global financial system. What we see throughout history, we have a model called central banking warfare. The central banks print money, and then the military and intelligence agencies make sure everybody takes it and you keep the system liquid. And essentially what you see if you go back through history, every 80 or 120 years, you do a reset. It's like flushing the system, and oftentimes what happens is you also move the currency system. So sort of the period of the Spanish flu was the last time we saw a major reset when the dollar, we went from a pound sterling system to a duopoly between the pound sterling and the dollar, and then after World War II, the dollar became the dominant system. So this is the real reset, and you can find everything at Solari. That included, we did a piece on CBDC, because part of the difference, this is a completely different reset than we've ever seen, and that is because an all-digital technology, an all-digital monetary system gives you the ability to do something very radical, and I will talk about that in a minute. The other thing that happened, does everybody remember the Kavanaugh hearings? Very salacious, very entertaining, very interesting, very galvanizing. While that was happening, the Republicans and Democrats, the House and the Senate, and the executive branch agreed to something called Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board Statement 56. Doesn't that sound really boring? And what I call it FASB 56. What FASB 56 did by administrative policy is said the federal government doesn't have to obey the laws and the provisions of the Constitution related to financial management. It doesn't have to obey the financial management laws, and it doesn't have to arc by, again, a secret process. And if you bring in the classification laws as well and the waiver powers of the National Security Director, that not only applies to the 24 covered agencies and 100 plus commissions, panels, and other organizations of the federal government, it also applies to the big banks and defense contractors who do business with the federal government. So what that means is, if you're an investment advisor, you look at the stock market and all the large cap stocks and the big bond issuers, their finances mean nothing. I no longer look at the financial disclosure of the US government because it's entirely meaningless since fiscal 2015, which is the last time we calculated the 21 trillion. Interestingly enough, we've talked this in the last 2 days about the debt problem. When we did the full survey that documented the 21 trillion missing from DOD and HUD, that was done by a wonderful professor from Michigan State University, Dr. Mark Skidmore, and his students. When we published it, guess what the outstanding debt of the United States was? $21 trillion. 21 trillion of undocumentable adjustments, $21 trillion of debt. So again, we don't have a financial problem, we have a governance problem. So FASB 56 went into position under a Trump administration. One of the first things I would do if I was coming in is I would end FASB 56. Okay. So after you publish the Going Direct Reset, after you publish FASB 56, what happened? We had a pandemic, and the Fed injected $5 trillion. And I'm going to grossly oversimplify. The Fed injects $5 trillion, much of that money going to centralized players and Wall Street, and then it shuts down Main Street. So you have fantastic monetary inflation, but you offset it with the deflation that comes from literally shutting down Main Street. It's interesting, the Biden nominee for control of the currency, who didn't get passed, had published a month before her nomination an article in the Vanderbilt Law Review, and she said, the wonderful thing about central bank digital currency is inflation is no longer a problem. If you have inflation, you just freeze everybody's bank accounts. Isn't that wonderful? Okay, so central bank digital currency. Central bank digital, the important thing to understand about central bank digital currency in an all digital financial system is it's not a currency, it's a control grid. Now, the process to implement central bank digital currency around the world is being overseen by the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. And the Bank of International Settlements is owned by its members. The New York Fed and the Fed are both, the Board of Governors are both shareholders in the BIS. 63 of the top central banks are in the BIS, and they are running a process with a major partnership with the Federal Reserve to implement CBDCs, and they're prototyping around the world. In 2020, October 2020, there was a panel at the IMF on cross-border payments. Jay Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, was there. Augustine Carstens was there, and Augustine Carstens said the following, and I'm going to play this for you in a second, but I want you to know I was basically raised and trained to be a central banker. I was asked to be a governor of the Federal Reserve and declined. But I was raised that way, and one of the things you're raised to understand is you never, ever You use pretzel talk. You never explain clearly what you're going to do. You know, you talk in circles. And this was the first time I had ever seen a central banker in English explain exactly what they were planning on doing and why. And I almost fell off my chair. And if you think I almost fell off my chair, you should have seen Jay Powell's face. Okay, so here's Augustine Carson's 57 seconds explaining CBDCs.
All our analysis on CBDC, in particular for the use of general use, we tend to establish the equivalence with cash. And there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that. Those two issues are extremely important, and that makes a huge difference with respect to what cash is.
One of the tremendous benefits that the BI has in implementing this is they operate under sovereign immunity. They are protected from, with rare exception, most laws, and operate behind. They can keep anything on their balance sheet and keep it secret. So they are behind the walls of secrecy, and they have established innovation hubs, which also extend sovereign immunity to them. They have a committee at the BIS that designates certain financial institutions, payment systems, and insurance companies as systemically important institutions. And for reasons I can go into in Q&A if you're interested, we believe they're extending sovereign immunities, and that's why certain institutions, no matter what they did during the financial crisis, don't get prosecuted. But this is a map from the BIS website of their innovation hubs at that time. And their partnership with the New York Fed is obviously a major one, the New York Fed being a leading shareholder, both the New York Fed and the Board of Governors. Okay, so the next video, very short, is Bo Li, used to work at the Bank of China, and now is the Deputy Managing Director at the IMF. This was in 2023, last year. Bo Li was talking about the programmability of money. Okay, the programmability of money. So let's watch this.
And finally, the third way we think CBDC can improve financial inclusion is through what we call programmability. That is, CBDC can allow government agencies and private sector players to program, to create smart contract, to allow targeted policy functions. For example, welfare payment. For example, consumption coupon. For example, food stamp. By programming CBDC, those money can be precisely targeted for what kind of people can own and what kind of use this money can be utilized. For example, for food. So this potential programmability can help government agencies to precisely target their support to those people who need support. So that way can also improve financial inclusion.
So hold up on this one, we're not going to play it yet. So what does that mean? By programming your money in a system where we have the cloud and lots of software and AI, I can make a different set of algorithms and rules for every person in this room. I can track you. It's the equivalent of putting, round-the-clock Stasi teams on you, but they're software bots and they're AI. And I can make up social credit rules as to how you can and cannot use your money. And if you don't accept my healthcare mandates or you don't accept my spatial restrictions, I can turn off your money.